Hey there, internet friends, and welcome to another Patreon early access episode of That Nerdy Site Show, a weekly podcast where the team members from That Nerdy Site get together to talk about our lives and all of the nerdy things we love about them. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey, and joining me for this Patreon early access episode, we have Logan Wilkinson once again. How you doing, Logan?
I'm doing great. Very excited for this topic.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. So we were trying to come up with ideas for what to talk about this month after last month's episode on basically TV shows from our youth. And as I was thinking earlier this week, you know what? Like, I know Logan will take any opportunity to talk about James Bond. So, and whereas I am much less versed in James Bond knowledge. So I will just kind of use it as an opportunity to pick his brain about what makes for a good James Bond movie. So that's going to be basically our big old topic of the show. But before we dive into that, a little bit of housekeeping. If you like what you hear, please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review, share the podcast with your friends, all that fun stuff. And if you're feeling extra generous and aren't already supporting us on Patreon, so you're getting this like well after the fact, you can always support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite to get early access to our monthly bonus episodes just like this one, without having to wait the extra month before it goes live to everybody else. And a special shout out to our Patreon producers, Pam Larson, Sherry Starkey, Teresa Wilkinson, and myself, Trevor Starkey. So yeah, let us dive in, Logan. What makes for a good Bond movie?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked, Trevor. I just so happen to have notes ready to go. No, I mean, I think first and foremost, at its most simple and basic level, a good James Bond movie has to leave you feeling something, right? And that emotion can be, sadness from like the tragic nature of something, or humor, or adrenaline pumping action scenes, or a really well crafted story, right, with well crafted characters and beats along the way. But it has to leave you feeling something. Some emotion has to be evoked out of it, right? And we'll dive further into this as the episode goes on, but I think you can kind of break down the James Bond saga, if you will, of 25 films over 50-ish years, whatever it is. And
60 years
look at
now. It's almost 60 years.
1962,
Dr.
right?
No
59
started
years,
62.
yeah.
Yep.
God, that's
I've
terrifying to think
I've
about.
got my research up on the screen here.
I follow along. Yeah, and I think that's terrifying to think about. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's one where you can kind of break down the pantheon of the series, right? Where they're like I said before we started recording, they're like 6 to 8 like great James Bond movies like that I think are legitimately like fantastic films in their own right, and also great Bond movies. There's a good middle chunk of really good to fine to fun at the very least, right? And then you have the ones that I think aren't particularly special at all to bad, and the ones that are bad in my view are ones that didn't leave you feeling anything, right? You just watched a movie for 90 minutes to 2 hours, right? You just experienced the thing. It didn't leave you particularly happy or sad or laughing. It just was kind of boring, right? It didn't have any sort of emotional impact on you. And so that, I think, is the tentpole for me of a Bond movie has to make you feel something while watching it. And that emotion can be very varied, obviously, but some reaction has to be garnered out of you by the time you finish watching the movie, I think is what makes, at its most basic level, a good Bond movie.
All right. So what in your eyes is maybe the prime example of a good Bond movie?
So I think that's a great question, and like many James Bond questions, is multifaceted. So I think it depends, right? And this is when we have to kind of start delving into like what kind of a James Bond do you like versus what kind of James Bond you don't like, right? And everyone kind of has their own preference with James Bond, a little bit like Doctor Who, which is like the exact same age. They're pretty good parallels, in fact. But I think I almost find the different James Bonds even more different at times than the different Doctors. And I think, our parents, for example, are probably, certainly my parents are, but I assume because you're roughly the same age that your parents would be as well, really liked Roger Moore a lot, right? Like my parents had one of their early dates at a James Bond movie, And I think that's the kind of thing that I think their generation really kind of vibed with in like the 70s to all the way through the mid 80s. Um, and that's a lighter, more lighthearted, kind of goofy, silly, kind of flippant James Bond. But I think when you think of what is a prime example of a great James Bond movie, I generally kind of fall back on three Bond movies that I think are kind of representative of three distinct eras. So you have the one I'm going to point to first is going to be Goldeneye for like our generation's era.
The one I can speak towards, it's probably the best.
And I think GoldenEye's a great Bond movie, right? Like I think GoldenEye's certainly it was, and then Daniel Craig, the rankings have kind of shifted, but certainly was at the time a top 5 Bond movie. Like I think the movie's just great from start to finish. I think Pierce Brosnan is such an innately charming and delightful to watch actor that he brings all of that into the role. And I think all of the Pierce Brosnan movies, which I have a soft spot for because I grew up with, except for one. One's not that great. We'll get to that. But we grew up with him, right? And I like him. And I think it's really interesting because he had grown up watching these movies, right? Like there's a little bit of David Tennant and Pierce Brosnan for me where like he'd grown up watching Doctor Who and then Pierce Brosnan had grown up watching James Bond. And I think they bring some of that into their performances and into their roles. And there's just, I think, this kind of glint in his eye, mischievous look of just enjoying actually getting to be this character. And he'd clearly studied the 4 actors before him who had done it, and he'd kind of brought a little bit of each one of them, right? Like he'd brought some of the rough edges and kind of nature of and brawler nature of Sean Connery. He had brought some of the kind of humor and wink in your eye-ness of Roger Moore. He'd brought some of the rougher edge of Timothy Dalton without sacrificing having a personality. He didn't really bring anything from from George Lazenby, because George Lazenby was a terrible actor, because he's a model. He's not an actor. But he did bring the emotional weight of Lazenby's one movie, I think, in his performance. And I think he kind of mixed this all up and made a very 90s cosmopolitan version of James Bond that I really identified with. GoldenEye is great, too, because, again, on my checklist of what makes a good Bond movie, it's got a great villain in Sean Bean and Alex Trevelyan. That whole backstory works really well. It's got an iconic, like, sidekick, right, in Zana Anatop, Femke Jennison, and she's great as well. She brings so much around, is clearly just having the time of her life. It brings, I think, so many kind of distinctly iconic locations and shots, which is important to a good Bond movie. And then I think, the music of Bond movies is really important in terms of, I think, opening the movie, obviously. And it's got a great theme. And then finally, like, it's a great story that makes sense that you can follow, which will become a problem for some of these movies. But that one is pretty clear cut, right? Like, these are two basically like BFFs. There was a betrayal, something happens, and then it's kind of this revenge mission on both sides almost, right? And it's relatively easy to keep track of. And dealing with the ramifications of, do we even need a James Bond in the post-Cold War era? And so GoldenEye, right, is like a classic example of a good James Bond movie. For a more recent one, Skyfall, which I think is almost flawless. And then for a classic one, you can really kind of pick any Sean Connery movie, I think. But my personal favorites are From Russia with Love and You Only Live Twice. And I think all of those have those same themes in terms of great locations, great music, a great villain, a great henchman or woman, and then a great kind of performance by the Bond actor themselves that kind of help carry the movie. And crucially, a plot that makes sense, that you can't get lost or bogged down in.
So I want to touch on some of the kind of like, when I kind of like envisioned pitching this, it was like, okay, let's talk about, the elements of a great Bond movie or just a Bond movie in general, and maybe how important one is over the others and all that stuff. And obviously, like the first component I would say is the Bond. How important is Bond himself in a Bond movie? I think because obviously we have Connery, as you touched on, Connery, Lazenby, who'd only done the one movie, Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig. How important is like Bond to the Bond movie?
So I think it's a great question, right? Like, this is like something that's like mildly debatable, maybe within like the Bond fan community, or whatever. But I think it's pretty important. But I don't think it's paramount, right? Like, I think, for example, like this to me is like the question where we're going to spend the most time talking about On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is George Lazenby's one movie, because that movie's really good. Like, that's the thing. Like, that movie works on like every other level other than him. Like, he just, and like, I don't want to be mean. Like, I don't have any desire to be like mean to people, right? Like, he was a model, he wasn't an actor. Like, it's this whole thing. But like, he's not good in the movie, right? And like, the worst part of that movie is every time he's doing stuff, basically, right? Because he's an Australian pretending to be a British person, right? Because he's not natively British. And then he's in the movie, for whatever reason, they have him trying to basically impersonate like a German or Austrian person for like 3/4 of the movie, it feels like. So he's an Australian doing a British accent, doing like a German accent, and none of them work. And he just is an actor, right? And he is the misfortune of going up against like great actors of the time period too, right? Like Dana Riggs is the Bond girl, is James Bond's wife, right? Like, that is the movie where like James Bond gets married. You have Blofeld, who is Bond's like most iconic villain in there in his second movie. And I think you just have so many elements that are clicking and working and firing on all cylinders. The movie's like really interesting to watch because it is so much slower paced, especially like, I mean, the whole thing, honestly, like I was going to say in the first half, but the whole movie's just paced very differently than the earlier Bond movies before it. And even after, we wouldn't really get another movie like that until maybe Spy Who Loved Me with Roger Moore, if not all the way until something like Timothy Dalton's two movies, which are all kind of like exceptions to the general Bond rule, right? Like, even Daniel Craig's movies don't move at that pace. And so I think you're allowed to savor these moments, these small kind of touches, right? You're allowed to savor the fact that, yeah, it is James Bond falling in love with the love of his life, right? Like, and I think it's done really well, right? And their chemistry is like weird, but it works, right? Like, that's like the one part that George Lazenby kind of does do right, is like he's got pretty decent chemistry with his female like love interest, right? And Diana Riggs is a fucking badass in her own right? Like, that's the thing. Like, she was coming off, I think it was like the British TV show Avengers.
Yeah, the Avengers, yep.
Where she was like a main character, and she's rad. I mean, she's in Game of Thrones 40 years later or whatever, and she's rad there too, right? Like, she's got such a presence and owns that movie, right? Like, I think it's a movie where it's a top 10 Bond movie for me, but it should be higher, right? Like, it's a thing of like, if it had Sean Connery in it, if it had Pierce Brosnan or Daniel Craig in it, I think that movie legitimately, it maybe wouldn't make the top 5 because the top 5 is stacked, as we might get to later on, but it would certainly be like 6 or 7. It'd be right there, right? Like, instead of being like 9 or 10, right? Like, it would rise the ranks higher based on that actor, right? And like, that's to me is how I kind of view Bond being important.
Yeah, it's interesting that, like, I mean, like, the worst Bond really only takes down a movie a couple notches.
The exception to this, I would say, weirdly enough, is for all of the other Bonds, it's how they define their arcs, right? Like, Lazenby's a weird example because he is in only one movie, so it's like they could roll the dice, get lucky, and have everything else work, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas to me, when you say how important is the Bond, it's how important is that Bond in that era, right? And that's when I look at Sean Connery and say, you know, he was in 6 Bond movies and only had 1 miss, which is Diamonds Are Forever. That was the only miss that he had, right? And it's not good.
Can you give me the Cliff's Notes of why, what happened there? Why, like, the George Lazenby movie is in there in the middle of the
Absolutely.
Connery stuff.
There's only a Cliff Notes version. It's not like a super long story
Because
necessarily.
this is all outside of the other Casino Royale, right? That was like an unofficial Bond movie.
Yeah, there are a few unofficial ones. Yeah, but none of these Bonds were in that unofficial one. That was like
Right.
Peter Nelson, something like that. But so basically, James Bond happened and it exploded. Like it was a huge success. And back then, they were cranking them out way fast. They were doing them basically every single year, right? So they were just like smashes out. And Sean Connery is getting thrown around the world in a whirlwind, right? He's like the biggest actor in the entire world because of the series. But he also, by 1967, he had done 5 Bond movies in 5 years, basically. Yeah. And so he was tired. He was exhausted. He wanted to do other things, right? Like he, I think, had gotten everything he could get out of that role. And for what it's worth, You Only Live Twice, which has long been like my personal favorite Bond movie, is a pretty natural stopping point. You kind of, because Sean Connery's run is actually a self-contained story. Like each movie builds off them before it. Like they didn't do that again until Daniel Craig, really, but like they all lead into each other very clearly. And so you finally meet Blofeld, you finally see who's behind Spectre and all this kind of stuff in You Only Live Twice, and it has its ending, which I won't spoil in case we ever do anything for it. But
actually, I think that's the one Sean Connery movie I've seen, but it was like back it was back in high school. I mean,
like it is the like volcano like underground layer. Like it is like so many iconic moments of Bond like from the 60s happen in that movie, and it like. It's
everything that The Simpsons and Austin Powers
and everything
make fun
all
of.
Parodied. Absolutely, right? And so, he was just ready to move on, right? For understandable reasons. And so, he left and they had this giant, massive casting call. And I'm actually going to do like a bit of a like fun fact tangent within this story, which is that every actor up until Daniel Craig, who eventually became James Bond, almost became James Bond earlier, right? So when they originally were casting Sean Connery, they almost picked Roger Moore. Like they were strongly considered picking Roger Moore for the role. And then when this vacancy happened, they again thought about picking Roger Moore. Ultimately, they didn't. They picked George Lazenby because, and this is true, he went to like the hair salon that Chubby Broccoli, who was like the executive producer of the series, was getting his haircut at, and like basically like demanded like an interview kind of thing.
I remember when the Hitman or when the IOI stuff broke a few months ago. I remember it being like this fun little side tangent that like, oh, the Broccoli dynasty owns the rights to do the Bond stuff, and everybody was just making fun of and laughing at the name Broccoli being in there. So
and it was,
I love that's apparently a long running thing.
The Broccoli and like it was Broccoli and Saltzman were the two guys who did it originally, and then Saltzman left in like the
Saltzman's
70s.
Less funny.
Yeah, and sold his stake to Broccoli, and then it's been all Broccoli ever since. And but yeah, he basically got like I want to interview, and so he interviewed him, and eventually got the job for whatever reason. God help them all. And then when he left, they were like, well, he was not great. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a movie that I feel like has garnered a more positive reception over time. I don't particularly think it was well received at the time as much, and part of that I think is just because next to Sean Connery, who just oozes charisma, right, and charm and sex appeal and all this kind of stuff, George Lazenby just doesn't. And so they put out a big casting call, or they thought about doing a big casting call, but instead they were like, hey, why don't we just offer Sean Connery, who doesn't want to do it, who wants no part in this, $1 million, which is like at the time was like a crazy amount of money to do the movie. Like, let's just give him $1 million to do it. And he was like, all right, I'll do it for $1 million. And then he did the $1 million. That movie wasn't good. He had basically, I love Sean Connery. Again, I'm a massive Sean Connery fan. I love his Bond. It's my favorite everything. In the space from 1967 to 1971, which is 4 years, Sean Connery basically aged in real life like 12 years. Like he aged a lot in that 4 years. And so when you see him in Diamonds Are Forever, it's like, oh, wow, he's aged significantly, right? And he'd wanted to pay from the second Bond movie on, but it was like significantly more apparent by 1971. and he had just gotten a little bit bigger. Like, he'd clearly, like, didn't need to take care of himself in the same physical shape once he wasn't Bond anymore, and he didn't. And so, yeah, it just didn't work. And so, again, they were like, all right, cool, that's not going to work, and we don't want to pay him $1 million again, probably. Let's do another casting call. And so they brought on Roger Moore, and then from there, it kind of happened like that.
It's so you did your little fun fact, so I'll pull in one of mine. And obviously this is affected largely by COVID because the movie should have come out last year.
Yeah.
But I was amused that Daniel Craig is now the longest serving Bond.
Is that 15 years now?
Yeah, it'll be 15 years when No Time to Die finally comes out since Casino Royale in 2006. Second would be, do you know it?
Oh, yeah, do I know it? Roger Moore was it for 14 years, but Roger Moore has done the most movies as James Bond.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, it was. Since I was just counting like first movie to last movie. So I had Roger Moore for 12 years, between 1973 and 1985, and then Connery would have been next at 9 years from 62 to 71. Pierce Brosnan, who we grew up with, there at 7 years, from what was that? 95 to 2002. Yep. Yeah. And then then you get it like Timothy Dalton and George Lazenby. Do you know the longest gap between two Bond films?
I sure do. Because so much of the fun of James Bond is the messy production rights and who owns everything. So for 6 years, from 1989 to 1995, there was no Bond movies because they were in a messy legal fight over production stuff and who owns certain characters and all this kind of stuff. And so from License to Kill happened, which is Dalton's last movie, and then all the way until Goldeneye. Messy times.
I mean, yes, but also between Spectre and No Time to Die, it has been 6 years. So
has it really?
Yeah, Spectre was 2015. So
that's gross to think about.
There's another giant gap for you there. So there's my fun fact. So let's back to the things that make a great Bond movie. So we talked about Bond. I would say like the other maybe iconic element. You always have your hero. So how iconic is the villain? How important is the villain, the bad guy, the evil mastermind to a Bond? Because you have your Blofelds, you have your Max Schrecks or whatever.
Yeah, that was a pull, Trevor. Absolutely, I'll give you that
Christopher
one.
Walken. I know that one. Yeah. It's like, and then you like.
That's good.
You have Alec Trevelyan, as you said, but like even there, like, and I wouldn't consider him as like a big bad, but even Trevelyan is supported by Alan Cumming as Boris, being snivelly and stuff like that. But then you have the newspaper guy in Tomorrow Never Dies.
We'll get to Tomorrow Never Dies. Don't you worry, we'll get there.
So what makes for a great villain, and how important is Bond's villain to his story?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, if I can double back for just one last second on the Bond himself, I think like we talked about, like Lazenby kind of got a break for just the one movie. But I do think you can see how important the Bond is in terms of the overarching like eras they're in. Whereas, Connery only had really one miss and then a great run. And I think you see how important he was in elevating the series and getting it off the ground. Like, I don't know if it would have become the same thing without him. I think in the same way, Timothy Dalton kind of defines his two films and I think brings them down in a lot of ways. Just because he is so constantly sad and angry and just kind of lacking a personality, and more, I think his movies are so hit and miss because he's just basically doing a parody of James Bond for 7 movies, and that works only so well at times, basically. But in terms of the villain question, I think a villain is so important, right? Like, I think to me that's like the 1-2 punch, right? Is being able to get a great villain with a great Bond, right? And I think they sort of they can bring the best out of each other, right? Because a great villain also, I think, ties into how good the story is, how much the story makes sense. Is there like a dumb plot device that is going to drag stuff down, right? Like, I think it's super crucial, and I think again you see during Roger Moore's era, it's such a long one and a weird one, that there's so many weird villains that don't really work, and it kind of hampers the movies, right? Like Christopher Walken fucking rocks it in A View to a Kill. Like he brings it, and he's got Grace Jones as Mayday and another like iconic henchman role, and like they're like bringing like they're having so much fun with it. Clearly, that like Roger Moore, who by that point is like 57, 58 years old, is kind of elevated again to I think one of his better performances. But you also have like Hugo Drax from Moonraker, right? And like even like Carl Stromberg from The Spy Who Loved Me, which is a good movie, but has like a fine villain, right? Like there are a lot of generic villains in the 70s and 80s. Again, I think of Timothy Dalton, right? Who doesn't necessarily have that much personality, so he needs a villain who does. And in, his first Bond movie, he doesn't. It's not even clear who the main villain is, right? Like it's the one where it's like there could be like 2 or 3 guys, and like the personality is just lacking from everyone across the board, right? And I think a good villain can lift a movie up if the Bond is okay, if the story's okay, right? Like a great villain can do so much for a story, obviously. But a kind of a wonky or just like plain fine villain can drag it down. And if you're getting a boring or not great villain with an only okay Bond performance, and then the story's kind of be like muddled together too, you eventually just get For Your Eyes Only, which is not good, as we'll get to. Where like nothing really works and nobody's got like any sort of personality or spark to it. And it's all just kind of vanilla and plain. Whereas on the best Bond movies that you're going to kind of look at, right? Like Skyfall to me is a great example of this. Javier Bardem was out of this world, right, in his performance, right? And I think he drew so much out of Daniel Craig, right? Like, because Daniel Craig had Casino Royale where he came out swinging and was having fun, and then Quantum of Solace is a movie where he says like 4 lines and is just sullen and angry and sad the rest of the time. And then Skyfall happens, and he's got such an electric chemistry with Javier Bardem, and I think you see that like the sparks can kind of fly with a great villain and Bond performance, right? Like I think Pierce Brosnan and Sean Bean were very similar in that, where like I think they just worked together really well. Like their chemistry was really in sync, and so I think all of the best Bond movies have a great villain performance. Again, going back to like an older one, You Only Live Twice with Donald Pleasance has a great like Blofeld's first appearance is so iconic and so great, and he, even though he only gets like 10-15 minutes at the most of like actual his face is on the screen and not just like his back time in the movie, he like just crushes every single moment that he gets. And so I think a good villain, again, sort of like Batman, can elevate the story, and a bad one or weak one can kind of just like bring it down a little bit, especially when how they pair with the Bond actor themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. The best stories really have the hero and the villain kind of as 2 sides of a coin,
and at their best, each fire on all cylinders.
Yeah. So another element that I would go to is the gadgets. Slash maybe the Q. Obviously the Q was the same for so long. So it's what, like 20 movies with one and then 5 with another or something like that. So we don't need to necessarily dive into that. But like the gadgets are one of those things that have become like quintessentially Bond. So how important do you think the gadgets and their related stunts or set pieces end up becoming to a film?
It's interesting because the Daniel Craig era has kind of done away with the gadgets in a lot of ways, right? Like they've really moved away, I think, and try to make it much more serious and grounded, and I think vied away from some of that, which is kind of a throwback to like the earliest, like the first few Sean Connery movies where they were very simple, like a knife and a briefcase handle kind of thing. And so in that way it's kind of like refreshing. But I don't know, like I loved Q, right? Like I think any Bond fan does, right? Like he was a presence from 1963 until The World Is Not Enough, which was 1999. So that's 36 years, if I'm doing the math right in my head quickly, of him just being there, right? Like of him just being this kind of recurring first like colleague and then more of like a fatherly presence to these people. And I think, you know, he's just fun, right? Like that dynamic was fun and charming. And even though they got rid of the gadgets, I think one of the great things they did was bring in Ben Whishaw in for Q because he's so great. He's so talented. And I think you see his and Daniel Craig's dynamic kind of somewhat reflective of like the early Bond ones where they were kind of a similar age. But I mean, I think the gadgets I like the gadgets. I think they're dumb and I think they're fun, right? Like, I think they have their limits. I think they have parts where they don't work as well, right? Like, I'm actually not as opposed to like the invisible car in Die Another Day as some people are like heatedly diametrically opposed to it. I think it's like fine. I think there are far worse gadgets.
I would say ahead of its time, since you had was it Spider-Man Homecoming? Like they have basically an invisible jet that uses the exact same tech, and it's just like, hey, we all laughed at this 15 years ago when it was in a Bond movie, but we're fine with it now that it's Tony Stark.
Yeah,
okay.
Like I think that there are way worse gadgets in a Bond movie, and if people don't think there are, they need to watch these movies because I'm telling you, there are way worse gadgets that don't make way less sense and are just kind of dumb. The invisible car serves its purpose and it's rad. Like it's a cool idea. And so like I think they're a lot of fun, right? Like I think especially kind of charting the evolution of them from like the Sean Connery era to Roger Moore to Timothy Dalton to Pierce Brosnan. It's really interesting to kind of see how they grow and evolve and get bigger and then kind of shrink back down again and then just go totally out of control in Pierce Brosnan movie. I will totally allow it. Like the Pierce Brosnan era Bond movies just spin so far out of control, sort of on a lot of fronts. But certainly gadget wise, like they are just totally like out of their mind by the last two of those movies. But I mean, like I think the gadgets are fun, right? And I think bridging this over to like a video game point of view, like they make it compelling, I think, and then add new things for you to do from a video game perspective when you're playing the games. And from a movie perspective, I think they allow you to keep in your toes and allow for cool set piece moments and these iconic images, right? Of like, you know, the Sean Connery Goldfinger ejector seat car, right? Like that's like a iconic Bond image, and that only happened because that's a gadget that he referenced one time, and I think they pay off more than they don't in my mind.
Okay. So another iconic, of course, Bond element, the Bond girl.
Yeah.
How important is the Bond girl to the films? And obviously this is said in the context of like the movies very much came out at a different time and have thankfully, I would think, evolved, especially in the recent years with the Daniel Craig era, into a different type of Bond girl kind of approach. But they very much filled that for 40 years plus 50 years, basically like the sexy femme fatale kind of appeal, either as a villain or a lover.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting one, and some people might disagree with me, but I think more often than not, by like the submissive margins, they haven't mattered too much, right? Because I think the vast majority of them are kind of forgettable, right? Like, to me, a Bond girl matters when she is like great, right? Where they do like where are these iconic ones, right? Like I think of like Pussy Galore, right, from Goldfinger, right, who is like such an iconic like character, right? And I think of obviously Tracy from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, who Bond marries, and I think of these kind of like sprinkled throughout the earlier era ones who really stood out and had kind of this presence here, right? Like Barbara Bach in The Spy Who Loved Me is great. And like totally held her own as a fellow spy with Roger Moore. And then, Timothy Dalton's Bond movies are weird for a lot of ways. Like we could do a whole podcast on just Timothy Dalton, even though he only did 2 movies, because they're so different. Like there's such a like weird, we're going to do this very differently thing. And like Timothy Dalton, I don't even know if he had sex with either one of his 2 Bond girls. Like they were each kind of held their own and were so distinct and we're strong. We're kind of the beginning of like the stronger Bond girl, but kind of becoming a more recurring presence. But certainly the first one didn't have much personality. And the second one had personality insofar as, you know, she didn't like James Bond for a lot of the movie, and then she did, kind of thing. And she was cool because she was like, you know, Ellen Ripley from Aliens kind of thing, could like hold her own gun and had like the ripped off like stuff and was like a badass. But like, I really feel like there's a list of like 6 Bond girls who I'm like, yeah, she's great, and the rest are like, oh yeah, like she's fine, to she's in the movie, I suppose, right? Again, going back to For Your Eyes Only, just couldn't possibly be more forgettable. And obviously,
the one I always go to is like the bad one of like Christmas or Christmas Eve, right?
Christmas Jones.
Christmas Jones, yeah.
Yeah,
Denise
from More Than Enough. Denise Richards.
Yeah. That one just being like, this is just the parody played out to its like extent of
extreme.
Yeah.
They named her Christmas just so they could get to the joke at the end of the movie that I didn't understand for 20 years, right? Of like, I thought Christmas only came once a year. And me being like, I don't understand.
Yeah.
But like, that's literally why they named her that. Like, for that one joke at the end of the movie, right? Like, and otherwise, yeah, she...
And
you know,
and so she could
Denise
say,
Richards.
"Don't make jokes about my name" or whatever.
Yeah,
that movie.
right.
Yeah.
Obvious exceptions go to Halle Berry, right, for Jinx, who was so cool. Like, there were like talks to give her like her own spin-off movie, which would have been rad because she's so cool and is pretty consistently one of, if not the best parts of that movie throughout the whole thing. She's awesome. Obviously, like, Vesper from Casino Royale is great, right? And that is a character who I think is so fully fleshed out and is an actual key integral character who is kind of their own person, is a human, right? Is actually like a 3-dimensional person. But otherwise, I mean, yeah, like, it's kind of unfortunate. It's kind of sucky, but there are only like, out of the 25 Bond movies, like 6 or 7 who I'd be like, are great. And the rest are kind of like, yeah, like, the movie kind of succeeds regardless of what they're doing, honestly.
But we do have the one iconic Bond girl that we haven't really spoken of, which would be Dame Judi Dench's M, which of course crossed a couple of the Bonds there, and certainly became like, you know, the most important figure in Daniel Craig's Bond's life. As you know, it was like a novel
arguably
change
Pierce Brosnan,
up
too.
in Pierce Brosnan's character as well. But yeah, so touching on her, obviously, you know, I guess comparing M across the board, M being an iconic kind of figure in the canon there. But how important is M to Bond's journey and to a Bond film?
I think M is really interesting because, like a lot of the series, there has been an evolution, right? Judi Dench is clearly the most important M of the series run. Like, that's pretty inarguable, especially with, I mean, again, even Goldeneye, like, she very much addresses, like, and, like, tears down Pierce Brosnan for being, like, a misogynistic dinosaur, basically. And says, like, this isn't 1962 anymore. This is 1995. We're going to do things differently. Like, get on board or get the hell out. And kind of runs her ship like that for the rest of the thing, right? And has great moments, like, in Die Another Day, where she was like, I'd have left you rotting in that prison. I wouldn't have bailed you out. I think you're useless to me right now. I think you're too far gone. I think, like, all this stuff. And has great moments with her just being, like, cold and clinical and being like, this is my job and you are a liability and I can't trust you, kind of thing. To obviously her way more motherly relationship throughout his run with Daniel Craig. Obviously starting with Casino Royale, where she gets a lot of great moments with him, but obviously culminated in Skyfall, where she, like, just absolutely smashed it out of the park in terms of her performance, right? But I mean, I think Judi Dench she's an unfair benchmark to judge on because she's Dame Judi Dench, right? She's like a legend and icon. But, like, I really liked the first M, Bernard Lee, who is it all the way through, that'd be 1981 to be For Your Eyes Only. And he's great. Like, he to me is like, yeah, like, he is the archetypal M who everyone has parodied since then, is his M, right? And, like, he's really fun. He's really cool. He's kind of got this like fatherly dynamic with Bond that I think works really well, right? And his and Sean Connery's dynamic is really good, and him and Roger Moore have really fun chemistry, I think, that works really well. And you see him kind of take on an expanded role over time because he is in so many movies, right? From Dr. No to For Your Eyes Only, that he kind of gets a bigger profile over time and gets to actually like leave the office and do things with Bond, and go visit him like on location somewhere. So I think he kind of had that going for him. I think Robert Brown kind of had the short end of the stick a little bit because he's in between the two like giants of the role in Bernard Lee and Judi Dench, and he's like fine. Like much of the late, like mid to late 80s Bond, he's fine. He's like there. He's a perfect fit for Timothy Dalton's Bond. I'll say that, right? Like that. Those two work together really well.
Okay. I'm trying to think. Something I floated upon as we were talking about that, and you obviously can speak to this in far more context than I can, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But how important is Bond as a reflection of the time he's in, I guess? And I say that speaking to really the only two eras I know somewhat familiar are the Brosnan and the Daniel Craig. And Brosnan always feels like let's return to form, or let's return to what people liked about, the 60s and 70s.
Let's
Bond.
have fun. Right.
Yeah, let's try and bring the fun back to it, and let's make him a more like womanizer kind of, but charming and all that stuff. And then I look at Daniel Craig as a direct response to the Jason Bourne character.
Yep.
And I feel like it's weird because I feel like that gets overlooked a lot when people are like talking about Daniel Craig's Bond nowadays, now that Bourne has been like dormant
out
for
of the
a
picture
while.
for so long. Yeah.
But like I remember Casino Royale coming out and being like, oh, they just Bourne-ified James Bond. Okay,
that opening fight scene is just
Jason
Jason Bourne. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you speak to how important that aspect of Bond is? I guess his timeliness or existing in his own time.
I mean, I think it's super important, right? Like, I think it goes back to that point I had said earlier of how each Bond is in their respective kind of run of films, I think is more telling of how important they are to each movie's success. And I think you see that in terms of also how much they reflect the time and place, right? Like, I love Sean Connery's Bond movies, right? And I love Sean Connery's Bond, but I also can't stand and hate aspects of Sean Connery's Bond and Sean Connery's Bond movies, right? Like, I wish they didn't have the problematic parts from the 1960s in them, and they do, right? And I think that's so reflective of the era and time they're made in, right? And I think, obviously, you can't have someone just replicate what Sean Connery did 50 years ago into the movies now because it wouldn't work in 2020, right? Like, that's just a thing that isn't going to function in the same way, right? And, like, even Roger Moore Bond, like, wouldn't work, right? Like, this, like again, what is essentially a parody of James Bond in some movies just wouldn't work. People would be like, what is this, right? Like, this would not be taken seriously at all. And so I think the time they're made in is so important to understanding and evaluating these characters, right? And also what the actor and what the movies are trying to do, right? Like, especially because every Bond movie from basically after Sean Connery left until the end of the Cold War was essentially about the Cold War, right? And so, like, yeah, like, obviously those movies are harder to replicate now where there's not the existential dread of nuclear Armageddon every day you wake up, right? Like, they're different movies. People wanted some lighthearted entertainment at the time. And so I think it's important in that regard. It's important, too, I think, in terms of understanding, every Bond is sort of a reflection of the Bond before them, right? Like, everyone kind of takes what came before them and either tweaks it or in some cases, like, radically flips it on its head to varying degrees of success, but they all act based on what came before them, right? And, like, Sean Connery was fortunate that he got to just, like, make the mold. This is going to be James Bond. This is what every single James Bond will be based off of from this time out and will be judged off from this time out, right? He set the mold, and George Lazenby and
Take
way
that,
more
Ian Fleming.
Yeah, right. And like, yeah, he totally destroyed Ian Fleming's Bond, and George Lazenby, but way more importantly, Roger Moore was a direct reflection of trying to do something completely differently, right? So, really, there are two camps of Bond that were done by the end of the 80s, right? You were either going to be a Moore or you were going to be a Connery Bond. And kind of, shades in the middle, obviously, but you're going to lean one way or the other. And more often than not, we've leaned towards Connery because it's harder to replicate Moore, I think, in terms of his just being so goofy. But, like, Pierce Brosnan was pretty, close to the middle. Timothy Dalton went very hard Connery. Daniel Craig, I think, has gone pretty hard Connery with, like, each movie. Like, in the Casino Royale, I actually think he's pretty close to the middle. And then has increasingly veered more and more, like, dark and brooding and brutish and all that kind of stuff. But they've all been a reflection of what came before it. Like, Daniel Craig, I think that Bond is that Bond because of Jason Bourne, and also because of what Pierce Brosnan was and what they didn't want him to be anymore, right? Like, they didn't want to be gadgets and shit. They didn't want it to be, like, outlandish over the top. They didn't want to have as much, like, goofy, punny humor. And they wanted him to be tougher. They wanted him to be more serious. They wanted him to be younger and making him into Bond, right? They didn't want to be like someone who was settled into it, like Pierce Brosnan very much was, right? Like, they were acting against Pierce Brosnan as much as they were acting from the inspiration they got from Jason Bourne, right? And in the same way where I've said for years, the next James Bond is not going to be like Daniel Craig, right? Like, they are not going to be this same dour, sad, at times emotionless James Bond, right? Like, they're going to be more fun, and they're going to lean more in the camp of Pierce Brosnan or Roger Moore. They just have to be, right? Because it's exhausting, right? They're going to be someone who almost certainly seems like they're enjoying it more, right? Like, seems like they're enjoying the role of James Bond more, right? Because, like, again, I've beaten Trevor over the head of this if you're listening to this on the podcast, but, like, Daniel Craig just so clearly doesn't give a shit in half his movies that it's frustrating, right? Like, that's the problem, right? Is that, like, Daniel Craig, when people talk about, like, oh, like, he's, like, my favorite, I think he might be, like, the best Bond, and it's like, but you're thinking that because of half of his movies. The other half are not that good because he just didn't give a fuck, basically, right? And, like, it's, like, especially in Spectre, it's so obvious. And so I think you're going to see something different from that.
Even the ones where he's, like, enjoying, in quotes, being Bond, like,
Yeah.
you look at those and then you compare those to something like Logan Lucky or Knives Out, and you can see clearly how much fun he's having in those films, that it's like, oh yeah, he never liked being Bond.
The only Bond movie that Daniel Craig ever had fun being James Bond was Casino Royale, because it was the first one and it was before any of the other shit happened. And then after that, he was like, I don't enjoy all of the other parts of being James Bond that aren't acting.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of being James Bond, right? It's like, it's the same thing with, like, being an MCU superhero. There's a lot that goes into it besides being an actor, right? And if you don't like that, that's totally fine and legitimate, but maybe this isn't for you, right? Is kind of would be my thing, right? And I think
he's the Christopher Eccleston of Bond.
That's a totally great comparison, actually. Right? Like, he doesn't
again
enjoy
making the line to Doctor Who,
yeah, like, he doesn't enjoy everything else about it, right? Whereas you have Pierce Brosnan, who is very much like David Tennant, like I said earlier, or like Henry Cavill, who loves being Superman, right? Like, that is something that he enjoys, and I think Daniel Craig just never has vibed with that part of it, and, like, it's through no fault of his own, right? Like, it's, you can't begrudge him for doing that. I would just begrudge him for keep doing it, right? Like, for keep going back for the payday, which I can't fault him for, but also I kind of can. But, like, I think I find your question most interesting also in terms of predicting what the next James Bond will look like, right? Like, I find that the most exciting part of, like, who is the next James Bond going to be, right? Like, what are they going to look like? What are they going to sound like? How are they going to act with the cast around them, right? Like, what is their story going to be? What is their arc going to be? And that's something that I find really exciting and really tantalizing, right? Like, I want a person of color as the next James Bond. I think that's something that's important for me. I think that's something that will open up so many fresh avenues to tell this character's story, right? Like, I think there are so many possibilities for basically an immigrant James Bond story within the United Kingdom kind of mythology and what that does and how that is reflective of where that country's own journey is, right? That there's so much room for them to explore that, right? There's so much room to explore what it means to be not necessarily a silver spoon, right?
Yeah.
Not be someone who has a giant estate and all this kind of stuff, but who did have to struggle, who did have to kind of do everything 2 or 3 or 4 times better than everyone else around them to get where he gets, right? Like, I find that dynamic way more interesting.
And it's fast because that's basically what Kingsman is. That's
100%.
I mean, like
Use
the
that template,
next
right?
Bond,
Like,
I think, is much like we talk about Jason Bourne inspiring the Daniel Craig Bond. I think the Eggley or whatever
Eggsy.
The Taron Egerton Eggsy, there will be some of that in the next Bond that we get. Whether it's like and some of the the actors that I could very easily see kind of filling that role would be a John Boyega or a Daniel Kaluuya or somebody like that.
Henry Golden, that Ben
Henry
always
Golding would be a great one. Yeah,
desperately wants. Yeah,
he was
right,
he was a ton of fun in that kind of role in The Gentleman last year.
Yep, that's what I was gonna reference as well. Yeah, like that's the thing for me, right? Is that like when Daniel Craig was cast, there was a big controversy about the fact that he was like
he was blonde,
blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy, and like that's not James Bond, right? I think we're past that in 2021 for the most part, with obviously the exceptions. That like I think we can have someone who not just is maybe not brown-haired, brown-eyed, but is, dare I say it, not even white, and be James Bond, and it not just be okay, but be so exciting, right? And be such a cool new avenue for the story. That like I'm really eager to see what they can do with that, right? And there are so many talented people of color actors who are British or Scottish or Irish, anything like that, that would all kind of count under the umbrella that I think could totally nail it, right? Like there are a lot of talented actors who could be James Bond, who could look like what James Bond has looked like for 60 years, but it's way more interesting for me if they do something that isn't just the same thing, especially for the series being 60 years old starting next year. This is how you reinvent it, right? Like you reinvented it in the post-Cold War era by having someone like Pierce Brosnan and by having the stories that they were telling and making it be like, like this character can last and he's still relevant in the post-Cold War era, right? And then that ended and Daniel Craig came in and reinvented it and said, hey, like this is a character who can be more modern and we can kind of expunge a lot of the misogynistic and sexist elements from his character and make him more of a, I think, flawed and troubled person. And I think the next step of that is saying, okay, let's open that up to everyone now. And not just people who look like me and who look like you, but to the wider audience of people who are watching and consuming films and stories across the globe. So that's what I find really exciting. Hell, I don't even care if you make it Jackie Chan. Just make it anyone who is not white, and I'll be pretty content for the most part, right? Like, there's so much more exciting things to do.
I mean, I feel like I could do without Jackie Chan just because of the age factor there. Like, it'd be an interesting call.
Have you seen?
But I'd be looking for a Bond that especially for the continued story of the franchise, can be Bond for another few movies.
For sure, they're going to do someone young so they can lock him up for a decade. They've seen the
exactly.
MCU. They want it for 10 years and 4 movies kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and since that, like, they've obviously seen how tough to do that was with Daniel Craig over the years. Over the last, decade and a half. Any other elements that I've missed that you think are really key to making a great Bond film?
Maybe 2, and the first in particular is pretty short, which is just henchmen, right? Like, I think that is such an element that is key to add in so much of the fun to that thing, right? And, like, it's maybe kind of petered out. Again, the Daniel Craig ones kind of got, like, they kind of jettisoned a lot of, like, the key pillars. Mm-hmm. So maybe I wouldn't mind seeing this also be kind of brought back in terms of, and also Gadgets is, like, adding in more cool, like, iconic henchmen, right? Like Jaws and Odd Job, Zana Anatop, Mayday, these kind of things. Like, I would love to see, like, these characters define some of these movies, right? Like, when you think of Goldfinger is literally named for the villain, and the first villain you think of that movie is Oddjob and not Goldfinger. Like, he's such a, like, outsized presence in that movie, and never speak and just be like basically setting the template for like every movie made since 1964 of like what a henchman does, like this big, strong, silent, brutish guy who's just a badass, right? And like
if what I'm about to say is correct, then it's literally the only thing I know about Moonraker. But Jaws is from Moonraker, right?
So Jaws is actually the only henchman that I know of that's like an actual henchman that is in 2 Bond movies. He's in Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker.
Okay.
Which are
so
essentially
partially right.
Yeah, you're totally absolutely partially right. You actually get the full credit. The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker are and I don't want to mince words here, are the exact same movie. Just Spy Who Loved Me is we're going to destroy the world and everyone's going to live underwater. And Moonraker is we're going to destroy the world and everyone's going to live in space. And that's the difference, basically. Everything else is exactly the same. And Jaws is in both. He undergoes a villain becoming a good guy arc in Moonraker. Let me be clear about this. It doesn't work, and no one likes it. But, like, shout out to Jaws getting a happy ending, I guess. But, yeah, like, Jaws is more iconic than either one of his 2 villains in those movies, right? Like, these villains who are just so, like, such a dynamic presence, right? And, like, I think that's something that they've kind of lost over time that I would like love to see be brought back is like these great villain like henchmen.
It's to video gamify it again. It's like a great mini boss halfway through the movie or something that they have to overcome to or that will knock them down and then they have to like overcome them later on.
Builds themselves back up,
without and I think wasting that initial confrontation with the big bad.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to the movies, right? Like, even, like, Grant in From Russia with Love, right? Like, is probably, I mean, not even probably, is, like, certainly more iconic than the actual villain of that movie, right? And I think those early ones in particular had such great henchmen, that's such a good template, that I think over time I would love to see it be brought back. And, like, again, henchmen can also go badly if they muddle everything, right? And it becomes unclear, like, again, Timothy Dalton's first movie where there's, like, 2 villains and, like, a henchman or 2, and it's like, I don't even know who I'm supposed to be focused on as, like, the main threat to the James Bond right now. Like, it can get, like, bad henchmen can also negatively impact the movie. And this all ties into, again, that second thing, which is just what is going on in the movie, right? What is happening in the movie is something that obviously is important. The story is important, but in terms of like how it affects everything else for obvious reasons, right? Like if you don't understand what is happening or if what is driving us forward isn't interesting, then it obviously bogs the whole movie down, right? Like if it's too complicated, if it doesn't make any sense, if you can't follow the plot, again, Quantum of Solace, something to do about water is all I know. It's just like okay. To, again, not to pick on it again, but also to pick on it, For Your Eyes Only, where, like, the main plot device is such a ridiculous thing of unimportance that they, like, this, spoil it for Your Eyes Only, because it doesn't matter. But only, like, a half spoiler, like, I'm going to still kind of, like, shroud it, but, like, they're just like, fuck it at the end. They're just like, it doesn't matter.
It's a 40-year-old movie. You can spoil it. That's fine.
But it's just like, they don't, it's like, it doesn't matter. It's like, whatever, it doesn't matter. The thing we've been chasing this whole movie doesn't matter at the end. It's like, what was the point of the movie? What was the point of the movie then, right? Like, when they do things like this, it's like, what are we doing right now, right? It's like Moonraker just being the not as good space version of Spy Who Loved Me. Like, there are constantly things where it's like, this isn't that great. But a good story, like a very simple good story, can lift not a good movie, right? Like, Man with the Golden Gun is the polar opposite example I always have for Your Eyes Only. For Your Eyes Only, again, I've picked on it a lot in this episode, but it's well shot and directed and acted and all that kind of stuff, and like it's fine. It's just incredibly boring, and it's not interesting in like what is the point of it, right? The Man with the Golden Gun is not a good movie. It is almost objectively not a good movie. It is like absurdly acted. It is like absolutely farcical. It is like all over the place. It's over the top and everything, but its central premise is incredibly good. The world's best assassin is given one job: kill James Bond, and they're gonna face off in a duel at the end. That's the movie. We're just building towards that, and it's awesome. Like, it works. Like, Is there a lot of bad in that movie? Unquestionably. Is it a top 10 James Bond movie? Oh my god, no. But is it so much fun from start to finish, both in deliberately good ways and hilariously bad ways? Yeah, it's a fucking blast. Like, and to me, 10 out of 10 times, I'd rather watch that movie than watch For Your Eyes Only, or watch Tomorrow Never Dies, or watch Quantum of Solace, or Spectre. Movies that just aren't fun or exciting, right? That don't do anything for me, right? Like, I'd rather watch the bad one that, again, makes me feel something, laughter and humor, and a great final duel between the two, than all the ones that are better made, but what's the point of it, right?
Yeah. Very, very cool. We didn't touch on him, but I have to give a shout out again to Boris from Goldeneye.
He's great.
Because when you were like henchman, I was like, yep, that is the henchman I know. Alan Cumming, phenomenal. First thing I ever saw Alan Cumming in easily. Mm-hmm. And when I like grab a click top pen, I still
do.
I still think of that, and I'll still be like, nope, got to click it 3 times.
Yep. I still do it. Yep.
Yeah. And I am invincible. Such so much
good...
fun, such an iconic like.
Exactly, he brings
like,
so much
ending.
fun and joy to it. Yeah. It's great.
He's bringing in such a great complementary energy to the much more like real and heartfelt feud between Pierce Brosnan and Sean Bean there, and he's like, because he's like, he doesn't take anything seriously, and he thinks he is better than everybody around him and that stuff, and is just having such like, he is such a fun comic relief aspect to that, while also having menace and like a loathsome side to him. So yeah, it was like, I always like think back on how happy I have always been to see Alan Cumming succeed in other things because of Boris.
Absolutely.
Really. Because like, if like seeing him in Spy Kids, and seeing him especially as a theater nerd, seeing him do a ton of things on Broadway, which is like obviously his real love would be stage stuff. It's always fun. And so like, when he got cast as Nightcrawler in the X-Men movies, I was like, yeah, cool, I hope you're awesome. And then he gets like, really,
that's right.
He doesn't get to do much as Nightcrawler, but still he's cool. He's Alan Cumming, so it's awesome.
I forgot he was Nightcrawler.
Yeah. So shout out to Boris,
Boris
as kind of the probably the most iconic henchman that isn't a henchman just for the sake of being a henchman in like the Bond in Goldeneye, basically in the game of your Odd Job and your Jaws. But yeah,
he's great. He's a ton of
fun. So I think it just kind of like, unless you have anything else, I want to do like a little just fun wrap up, rapid fire, like not quiz, but like get your impressions. So and I think I know some of the answers already just based on how we've kind of spoken about them, but best Bond for you is Connery?
So yeah, I mean, I think Sean Connery is the best Bond, both in terms of, I think he's the best inhabiting that character, and also in terms of best, like, bad and average in terms of his movies. I'd pick Sean Connery, but with a unequivocal shout out for Pierce Brosnan, who I just find utterly charming.
Okay. Best villain.
See, this is a way tricky question. I think the most important villain is Blofeld, and what he did for the first 7 Bond movies, and his kind of presence in the background and increasingly to the forefront. The thing about Blofeld is that he's portrayed by 3 different actors in his 3 movies that he's on like screen for. I think his appearance in You Don't Live Twice, again, which is I have a very soft spot for. I think Telly Savalas, I think is his last name. And On Her Majesty's Service also does a great Blofeld. And then it's like, you have to give Javier Bardem and Silva a shout out, because he's just like, I mean, he like, that is like an Oscar like nominated kind of like best supporting actor kind of performance. It is just extraordinary. And then Sean Bean, I always have a soft spot in my heart for Alec Trevelyan.
Yeah. Who did Christoph Waltz play in the Daniel Craig one? Is he also playing Blofeld, or
yeah? There's a whole bunch of bullshit.
Was it like a fake off?
It's like a whole bunch of thing where like they were like, he's not Blofeld, and then it's like he's Blofeld, and it's like, what are we doing here? Like, just don't be, Okay. Yeah, but his Blofeld didn't vibe with it as much.
Yeah. I mean, just because it sounds like largely because the the movies have not really fed into them
Yeah,
like the originals one did.
yeah. It's not. He's not the worst Blofeld though. Like he's got that going for him.
Yeah. Favorite gadget and or like car, I guess. Because the cars seem to be large, like some of the biggest gadgets.
That's a great question. There's so many fun ones. Shout out to Die Another Day for just like a shout out. It's a fun movie. But because it came out on the 40th anniversary of the series, they put in a reference to every single James Bond movie in it, and it was super ham-fisted and heavy-handed at times. Skyfall did it way more elegantly for its 50th anniversary. But there's a whole scene where they're just like in a workshop of just like old gadgets, and it's like, here are a bunch of references to the movies. But it's like, it was also fun because you got to see stuff like, yeah, like James Bond had been like dressed up as an alligator in one like underwater thing. That's a fun gadget. The jetpack he's in, like an early actual function like jetpack thing from like 1964 for Thunderball or whatever, like 65, is rad, and it's super cool at the time. The ejector seat, right, is like one it's hard to argue against. But ultimately, like, because we're on a good Goldeneye kick, like, I am gonna pick the pin that explodes from Goldeneye, because that is such a smart gadget that like actually like serves its purpose perfectly, right? And like, you could carry with it anywhere. Like, it's not like, oh, what is this giant fucking crocodile you have next to you as you're trying to get into a body of water here? It's like, no, like, it's a pin. It can go anywhere to you. It is like a classic, like, Alex Rider-esque gift, like, that he would get while he would do shit in, like, the books. Like, that to me is like a quintessential Bond gadget.
Yeah, I would say though, it's a great gadget except for all of the people it would have inadvertently killed.
Sure. Yeah. Also true.
Because somebody pick it up and click it just because they're clicky top pens. They're great.
And then boom.
So apart from Lazenby, I guess is Dalton your least favorite Bond?
It's tricky. I think Lazenby's like objectively the worst.
I mean, yeah.
And like not even like necessarily like through any fault of his own. He's just like, this is not what he's supposed. He's not an actor.
It's more. I guess the question, it doesn't really matter, is because I want to go through favorite Bond movie from each Bond, I guess. And
that's a way more fun question.
Lazenby
like
really only has the one, and Dalton has two. But so yeah, it was basically, it started out as, if Dalton is your least favorite Bond or second least favorite Bond, what's your favorite of his two movies? But let's go through.
It would be License to
Connery's,
Kill, right? Like,
so Connery's your favorite Connery one first.
Connery's so hard again because I think all of his first 5 movies are all just so good. Dr. No is definitely the roughest around the edges out of his first 5. I mean, Diamonds Are Forever is not good, but out of like that first 5 film run, Dr. No is the roughest. It's the first, and they're figuring it out. I think, like, I legitimately think that like From Russia with Love is like almost a perfect movie. Like, from start to finish, I think the movie's like almost flawless. Like, it is so simple, it is so streamlined. It is kind of like a bottle movie almost, like a bottle episode of a movie. It's really cool. And it was Sean Connery's favorite one that he did too. So I think that is always a good pick. That's probably like my second favorite Bond movie. Goldfinger is like obviously like a lot of people's like top pick. I really like You'll Live Twice. It's got its problematic moments, but like, I think that movie is like what I think of when I think of James Bond. Like, globe-trotting adventure, like beautiful locations, like iconic layers, like literally that is like the volcano underground layer. You finally get to see Blofeld after 5 movies, and like, it's like the iconic villain. Sean Connery's at like his full power as James Bond right now. Like, he is like firing on all cylinders. Like, I think that movie for me is gonna be my favorite Sean Connery one. But a special shout out From Russia with Love, because that movie's like maybe slightly better made. But From Russia with Love, I mean, not From Russia with Love, but You'll Live Twice is like a perfect James Bond movie.
Cool. And then obviously, yeah, on Her Majesty's Secret Service is going to be
a great
George
movie.
Lazenby pick.
That's the thing, yeah. Roger Moore is who we're going to do next, I assume, is like the trickiest one of them all. Roger, I have such a weird relationship with Roger Moore. Like, I just don't enjoy like half his movies, and the other half I like find myself really fascinated by. I think Live and Let Die is his best movie, which is his first one. I think it's super cool. I think it's so much fun. Jane Seymour is the Bond girl. Mr. Big is a great Bond villain. And I think that and Baron Samedi as like a wild, crazy, iconic henchman who like can't die is such an awesome idea that they can like incorporate like the voodoo shit for that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just great. Obviously, like Wings, Paul McCartney doing the theme music. It's like maybe the most iconic one. And also like, I mean, that is like a great Bond movie. I do always feel the need to give a special shout out to A View to a Kill, which I just really love. Again, it's kind of like Man with the Golden Gun. Like, is it great? Great? Maybe not. But like, Christopher Walken is Christopher Walken and just enjoys the hell out of that. And is like so clearly having fun that even though Roger Moore is like literally part of AARP by this point in time, he's so old, it works so well. A View to a Kill does have my favorite Roger Moore fun fact story, though, that I might have told you before, which is he had tried to retire 2 movies earlier and then got brought back for Octopussy and then tried to leave again and got brought back. And he, while filming A View to a Kill, he talked about how he knew it was time for him to retire as James Bond when he realized that he was older than his female co-star's mother and was like, I can't do this anymore.
Ugh.
I have to, I can't be James Bond any longer. And yeah, so he decided to stop being James Bond after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Timothy Dalton, I'm guessing License to Kill.
License to Kill, like,
because The Living Daylights is a movie I don't think I've ever heard of spoken until looking at this list of Bond movies.
Living Daylights is like
you could have told me that was the name of a movie and I would have been like, oh, that must be a zombie thing or something.
It's such a plain movie, but like it's charming just for how different it is, but like it's not very exciting. License to Kill is dark as hell. It like is really like they like were like we're going dark on this one and they ratcheted up. It's like really intense. Like Felix Leiter, who again is like James Bond's like American CA like BFF throughout the movies. And the thing I always loved about Felix Leiter is that like throughout all of James Bond's run until Jeffrey Wright became like the recurring one for Daniel Craig, he was played by a different actor like 14 times. Like he just kept getting different Felix Leiters in every movie. And then in License to Kill, they brought back an old Felix Leiter to be Felix again for like his wedding, all this kind of stuff. And then they just murder Felix's wife and brutally torture him. And it's fucking intense. And so like the whole movie is like James Bond going on like this like bloodlust revenge mission. And it actually sort of pairs well with like Timothy Dalton's way more like intense, like dark, no personality vibe. It's still flawed, but like we get a young Benicio del Toro who is Benicio del Toro, so great. And a really weird Wayne Newton appearance and cameo as like a televangelist that like doesn't work on any level, but like kind of works. And like that's kind of the theme of License to Kill, where like it doesn't really work, but like I've always really liked it as a kid growing up, just because it is like so intense. Like if a James Bond movie would ever have been rated R, it would have been that one. Like that's like the closest I feel like they ever got to being like, we're just going fucking for it. So yeah, it'd be License to Kill.
Pierce Brosnan, I assume Goldeneye.
It is Goldeneye, but I will, to my dying grave, always love The World Is Not Enough, because that's not a great movie, but again, like Man with the Golden Gun, it's so much fun. Like Denise Richards is not great. The Christmas Jones thing is a terrible bit, but like the movie as a whole is like so absurd that it works, right? Like Renard is such a weird villain, right? He gets shot in the head by another 00 agent, but the bullet doesn't kill him. It's just like it's slowly traveling towards his brain somehow.
I was trying to remember like who the bad guy is in that one, because I was like, that's not the newspaper guy. That was Tomorrow Never Dies.
So he's like invincible basically until like it hits his brain, and like it's kind of cool. Like, and the movie has like a very late 90s charm to it that I really enjoy. Like it's always kind of been like one of my favorite movies, even though it's not good. It also helps that it was probably in the running for being the first one I would have seen in theaters. I'd have been too young for Tomorrow Never Dies, so like that probably would have been also like where like I first saw him on the big screen. And like it's rad. It's a ton of fun, right? Like it is a perfect movie for a 7 or 8-year-old kid to see. And then like just keep that mentality when you see it again from that point onwards, right? Like to be like an 8-year-old kid and be like, this is a blast. It also has one of the most quoted lines for me, I don't even know why, of any movie ever made, which is Electra King, who is the love interest alongside Christmas Jones. She's got like a back and forth.
She's kind of like the Xenia Onatopp character, right?
Yeah,
Where she's like
exactly.
the henchman, but like there's a flirtatious thing there.
Except for like it's like a trick where she like acts like she's good, and then like to end like it's real that she's not. But she has a line that she says that Renard says later on, which is where she got it from, that tips and bomb that she's a baddie, of just what's the point of being alive? What's the point of living if you can't feel alive? And I think about that line, no shit, like once a week, still to this day, because it'll like pop in my head. I'm like, that's a great fucking line though for a bad guy to say. Like, what's the point? Especially for one who can't feel anything anymore, right? Like Renard can't feel any pain, he can't feel anything, any emotion, any senses, any touch. It's a great line. It's such a like, what's the point of living if you can't feel alive? Like shout out to a cheesy 90s Bond movie for asking some philosophical shit out here. I'm here for it. It's a great line.
Daniel Craig, I'm guessing Skyfall.
So I think Casino Royale is phenomenal as well. That's because like I think he's got two brilliant movies, and one that's like fine in Quantum of Solace, and one that is like one of my least favorite movies in the last decade, Inspector. I think it's just terrible. Mm-hmm. Like Casino Royale is way more fun probably because it's like a way more like chippy James Bond still, obviously, until the end where it's brutally sad. But no, I mean, like, I think Casino Royale is like a top 5 or 6 James Bond movie. Like, I think it is like phenomenal. But I mean, I think Skyfall legitimately is like one of the best movies in the last 10 years. Like, I think it is like an incredible performance all across the board. And just objectively one of, if not the best James Bond movies ever made. Like, just from like a pure house movies made level, it is up there with like only 1 or 2 other movies. And I haven't seen it in a few years, but like I constantly, like I have like my holy trinity of like these are the 3 best Bond movies to me, and that is always in there and always bouncing back and forth. Like, do I push it higher than this or not, or do I just leave my childhood favorites higher? Yeah, Skyfall is incredible. Like what they like, we didn't really get into it that much, but like what Skyfall does with James Bond as a human being, as a character, and as a mythological figure is so brilliant on so many levels. And Sam Mendes, who directed it, who obviously he's gone like is like an Oscar-winning director, and was a lifelong James Bond fan, and I think that shows in how they approached and respected his story and his backstory and how they paid everything off, and like the fact that it's also the 50th anniversary movie. Like everything just works so well with that movie. And they do so many cool things in terms of twisting in inside out and outside in all of James Bond's like mythology and what makes that character who he is in a way that you haven't seen. Goldeneye did some of that, but other than that, like since they literally built that mythology with the Sean Connery movies, it's brilliant.
Yeah, I remember like not the casting, but the entertainment news being like Sam Mendes is going to direct the next Bond movie for Skyfall, and being like,
yeah, how they pulled that,
the American Beauty guy. Okay.
Yeah,
all right. I mean, like
that
was a great movie that I watched for like theater in college and stuff, and like we did a deep dive into all of it, all the ins and outs of it and stuff, and it's a great character examination. Yep. Don't know how that's going to translate into a spy movie. Oh, it's not going to be a spy movie. It's going to be a character examination of James Bond.
So cool.
Okay.
And his relationship with M, and his relationship with his parents, and his relationship with like the old groundskeeper. Like, it is so smartly done on so many levels, and it's also one of the movies I talk a lot about with The Dark Knight. How I think The Dark Knight's just like a perfect movie, but like how, again, like Back to the Future, how The Dark Knight is one of like a very rare handful of movies that I genuinely didn't know what was going to happen next, right? Because in most movies you watch, like movies operate on the path of like, this is how a movie works, right? Like this happens, then this happens, and then like this, and this is gonna happen, right? Like these are how the movies kind of flow. This is how the stories are told for the most part. You kind of can predict where we're going for the most part. There are surprises, but like you kind of can predict where we're going. The Dark Knight, I had no idea where we were going. Like there was a point in time where like everyone was just dying, and I was like, I have no idea. And I was like, is the bad guy gonna win? Like I genuinely was like, is the bad guy gonna win in this movie? Like I have no idea what's happened. Like it is so like unhinged almost from like how movies work, and like I'll never forget being so unsettled watching that movie. And in a similar way, Skyfall, there are points in that movie where I'm like, all right, cool, this is what's gonna happen next. It's a James Bond movie. And then it didn't happen, and it did like way different stuff, and like it broke the format of James Bond movies, and it broke the format of like, again, just kind of movies in general. That I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen next, and that is such a wild and exciting sensation to have right now. And so I think it's just so
especially
smart, so
especially for you as a lifelong Bond fan, like that, the fact that the series can surprise you 50 years on.
Yeah, right. Is like such, and again, Casino Royale did the same way. Like I think those movies, the modern ones that can leave me being like, I never saw it coming, and it left me feeling like very like unsettled. I really admire. Whereas again, Spectre, which is supposed to be a follow up to this, did all of the opposite things. Where it's like I could have from the trailer, I was like, I think this might be this, but like maybe they can pull it off. And then like from the opening beats, being like, this is what's gonna happen to this movie. Like this is where we're gonna go, and like hitting every single point that I thought we were gonna hit. It's like such an uninspired follow up to a great movie.
Yeah. So I here's the question, and also since we didn't really touch on it as like elements of a great Bond film, what is your favorite Bond theme, and how important is the music to the Bond movies?
I mean, my favorite Bond theme is "Live and Let Die" because it's from Paul McCartney, and because it's an absolute banger. But I think,
admittedly, I definitely knew about the song long before I ever knew that was a Bond movie.
I think the Bond theme can be super important in terms of setting the tone and like kind of vibing with the spirit of what this movie's going to be, right?
Especially, I guess, like the opening sequence, especially in later films. I don't know how prevalent they were in the earlier stuff, but
they're in all of them except for Dr. No, the very first one.
Okay.
I think that the opening theme, like the title cards and the theme music, can be so important, especially if they're used really innovatively, right? Like in Goldeneye, they kind of show like the fall of the Soviet Union, like and like them smashing like the hammer and stick and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously for me, it's very divisive. It's like a very controversial take, I guess. But I have always really liked the Die Another Day opening credit sequence that like actually gives you like a story being told, right? Like it shows you like Bond being captured, Bond being interrogated, Bond being tortured over like the 18 months that it takes place in, whatever. And I think it's just such a cool idea. Madonna's like great, whatever, but like I think it's such an awesome thing.
Cool. And then the last couple of questions for you I have. We kind of flirted with the idea earlier, but who would you, like, dream scenario, who would you cast as a next Bond?
Yeah, I mean, John Boyega, Henry Golden are great examples. I think that like I wouldn't hate if they did go like an unknown route. Like there's so much untapped potential there, obviously. I think there's so many people who could be a great James Bond, right? Like we are not bereft of talented choices. And I just want to see them in terms of next James Bond expand outside the usual box, right? And like really innovate on who this character is, right? Like Daniel Craig has deconstructed who James Bond is, and so build a new James Bond, right? Like you're giving this chance basically, like he's taken the mythology of this character and totally deconstructed it and reworked it and rewired it and shown and just laid it bare basically. So build a new one, right? Like build a new James Bond and who this character is and what he can be for a new generation, right? And you can kind of expunge some of the worst aspects of this character now, I think, and really let shine a new era for this character and a new page going forward for what James Bond and what James Bond movies and stories can be. So that's what I'd kind of want them to vibe for, and that's what I'd kind of want them to look for in terms of the actor they pick as well.
And then kind of coupled with that, who would you want to see as the director of the next James Bond?
That, I think, is a super interesting question as well. I think that a great directing choice would be... So, like, it's never going to happen, but, like, Dream of Dreams one would have been, like, I'd have always loved to have seen a Steven Spielberg James Bond movie. Like, he's got such a, I think, taste for, like, adventure, especially, like, again, like, 80s and 90s Spielberg. Like, I think could have nailed, like, that, like, pace, action, adventure, like, Indiana Jones-esque energy to it. I think could have been a ton of fun. I think Pierce Brosnan would have been great for a Spielberg-esque movie. Now, who would be a good James Bond director? Justin Lin, right? Like, I think could be a good one. I think, again, like, in terms of, like, we're never going to get it, but it'd be really, really, really interesting to see what it would look like. Is, like, what would a Tarantino Bond movie look like, right? Like, someone who is, like, such a film expert, like, and, like, historian, like, what would that look like? And, like, I would love, like, a slowed down, talky Bond movie. That'd be super interesting with, like, moments of just, like, explosive violence. I think that I would love to see something from, like, I think Catherine Bigelow, honestly, like, Zero Dark 30 style James Bond movie could be really rad. And then otherwise, I mean, who are other big, promising, up-and-coming directors at the moment? Sam Mendes has already done it too. Give me a Bong Joon-ho James Bond movie. Give me that. He did Snowpiercer and it slayed. And that's an English language movie. So give me that. Let him do, like, let people who aren't British but are fans of film do a Bond movie. And I think they could get such interesting results with that, right? Like, let, like, Alfonso Cuarón do, like, a Bond movie, right? Like, let, like, these kind of people who have such interesting ideas, I think, and come from outside the UK do a Bond movie.
A Guillermo del Toro Bond movie?
I was just thinking that, like, that'd be so interesting. Like, what would that look like, right? Like, I would love to see that his interpretation of what a James Bond movie would be.
Yeah.
Like, bring from outside of the UK and expand what these movies can be, I think is super interesting to me.
I think a couple other interesting choices that came to mind for me would be, like, a Rian Johnson, of course, especially as you kind of talk about, like, wanting to deconstruct and rebuild a new Bond. I think that's basically Rian Johnson's bread and butter, as we've seen in stuff like Knives Out, and Force Awakens, or not Force Awakens, Last Jedi, for whether you love it or hate it. But then what was the other? Who was the other person I was going to pull? I like the Bong Joon-ho.
That'd be if you could imagine.
Yeah, especially because we're hot on the heels of Chloe Zhao, obviously winning Chloe Zhao.
Yeah,
winning best. They're the best.
I
Director
thought
and
about
stuff.
her as well.
But I'm sorry. The correct answer, of course, as always, is Zack Snyder. So what
Oh,
are we gonna do? Got to see the Snyder cut of Bond.
I will say, you make that joke, but, like, it would be really interesting to see what his version would be. But you know what that makes me? It'd be, like, fine. But you know what that makes me think of instead is, like, jumping off of that. You know who'd be actually like a possibility maybe, and who'd be, like, really good for it would be the Russo brothers. Because Winter Soldier is just a 70s espionage thriller, basically. Like, can you imagine if they could do a Bond movie? Like, I don't even know what their MCU contracts look like at this point, but, like, if they ever got freed of that, like, it would be so cool, I bet, if they could do a James Bond movie.
Yeah. Who would you want to see? I guess like as another fun, like, experiment, not even having, like, an idea of who the character would be, but who would you want to see as the Bond villain?
Ooh.
Because, like, just in the conversation we're having, like, not I guess in part, like, most directly bouncing off of the Russo's comment, I go to, I think it would be really fun to see Robert Downey Jr. in, like, Sherlock mode as, like, as basically a Moriarty to this Bond, effectively. I think that'd be a fun potential, like, because obviously he has, mountains and mountains of charisma. I think could be a fun energy too, especially if it was like a, coming up from their bootstraps kind of immigrant story type of Bond or something like that. Having, big moneyed RDJ, out there or something as like the anathema to that, I think would be fun.
I think like Oliver Cromwell in that regard too, like someone who could play, I think, a really like upper crest like British aristocrat, right? And like again from like coming up from
You've just got him on the
nothing.
mind a lot because he came up
Yeah.
in our video game pitches episode too this week.
I think he just plays that kind of character so well to me, like this kind of like patrician kind of
Just
archetypal figure.
Babe in the Babe Pig in the City just really did a number
Yeah.
on you apparently.
Yeah. And so like I think he'd be great as that kind of thing, right? Like I think that it could be really interesting to see maybe someone like a young Bond villain again in a very like Goldeneye or like Black Panther-esque thing, where like the people from kind of like the same age who like rose up together and then broke apart.
So I'm just
and, like,
realizing
what
you
that
meant
gimmick
you
would
meant
look like.
James Cromwell, right?
Oh, I said Oliver Cromwell. Yeah, I meant James Cromwell.
Because I was like, wait, Oliver Cromwell and James Cromwell are not the same person. I Google Oliver
No.
Cromwell. I'm like, oh, that's right. He was like from Shakespearean, like 16
the
or
guy who like
1600s
overthrew the
or whatever.
kings and
Yeah.
shit. Yeah, James Cromwell. But like someone young from like the same age as the actor who could play like again like kind of like a brother vibe who like broke apart, like who either went up through training or like they were in the same neighborhood when they were growing up and one went good and one went bad essentially.
Just do
So, like,
another
I think
Alec Trevelyan.
Yeah, like, but like, or like again, like I said, like a Black Panther-esque vibe too. Like, I think that could work really well. And like, I don't even know who the last like young, really James Bond villain would be. Like maybe Mads Mikkelsen, right? Like otherwise,
It's weird. It's
know.
weird thinking of him as a young villain, and it was also
Yeah.
weird realizing that he was in Casino Royale all those years ago.
he's great too.
But even that just made me think. I actually think I would want to see, especially if you take Bond or the 007 as like the code name, take a 007 that goes rogue who is an older agent, and the new 007 is basically tasked with finding him and tracking him down. And so like that's your bad guy is the old-timey spy who's been doing this for years and is, well poised and knows all the tricks with like versus the young blood kind of thing.
You're thinking of the hit video game GoldenEye Rogue Agent, I see. So
I'm not,
shout
no.
out to that. I agree. That's a great pitch. Yeah, I mean, I think that also super cool. Like, and that you could do something with like Jeremy Irons, right? Oh, Jeremy Irons actually would be a great Bond villain. Holy shit, that's my pick. That's a great pull, Logan. Yeah, Jeremy Irons would be rad as a Bond villain. Actually, he'd also be a good M if anything ever happens to Ralph Fiennes. But like Jeremy Irons would be so cool. Like, I think he has that kind of like again distinguished former agent kind of vibe to him, gravelly voiced. Guy who
Just basically
gets turned
have him play his
for
Die
whatever
Hard
reason.
with a Vengeance character or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's you, Jeremy Irons. That's my pick.
Nice. Any last Bond thoughts you wanna throw out there?
Right, like I think the most important thing to understand with James Bond that I always tell people is, if you don't like James Bond, I totally understand. Like I get it. Like there's a lot of not good within the series. I think that you have to embrace the series as one that, is fun and is goofy at times and is something that, again, is just supposed to make you feel something, right? And if you come out of it and you enjoyed yourself and you had fun, and that's going to be fun to edit around, and you did all these other things.
I'll just leave it in.
I think it's one for me that don't take James Bond too seriously unless it's taken itself too seriously, right? And like most of the time it's not. And like when it does, I think it nails it more often than not, right? And so I think, try to enjoy the series for what it is. If you can't, that's totally respectable. I totally get it. But yeah, like I think there is a lot of fun to be had going through 25 movies over 59 years in the series, right? Like there is simply nothing else like James Bond in all of cinema. And so I think it's a really interesting example of how movies have grown, how storytelling has gone, and how each individual era has kind of impacted movies at the time, right? And like I think it's a cool time capsule that keeps growing and keeps getting older. And so that's what I would say. Like just enjoy James Bond for what it is, or don't, but it's there to have fun with, and there are few things better in the world than waking up like on a holiday or like on a weekend, and like back in the day it would be like Spike TV having a James Bond marathon on. Like it's such a chill thing to just like unwind to and just sit back and, eat pizza, just sit in your pajamas all day and watch a couple James Bond movies and just have a great time.
There you go. Well, thank you, Logan, for sitting down to discuss what makes a good Bond movie with me.
Absolutely.
And all the other things we kind of tangent out of there. That's going to do it for this episode. So let's go ahead and kind of do our little section of plugs, which is always weird on these time capsule episodes. But you can follow Logan at Lefty Logie. Anything you want to give a special shout out to there, Logan?
I'm going to give a shout out to myself and Trevor's Let's Play series of It Takes Two, which by the time you're listening to this on YouTube after the month is all finished and done with. And if you have this on Patreon exclusive, then you can watch the first 6 episodes of Let's Play series right now, and be excited for the 2 to come. Also, stay tuned if you're listening to this when it goes live on YouTube. There may be a new Let's Play series where you've done at that point in time. I'm excited about that, but who really knows? These are all weird time capsule episodes, and it's impossible to say. Otherwise, just stay tuned for everything on YouTube. There's so much content there, and on the site as well. Oh, actually, if you're listening to this a month after it went live, go check out an interview episode we did of News You Care About with Kyle Seeley. And if you're listening to this when it goes live on Patreon, look for it
next week
tomorrow.
Basically.
Yeah. Basically.
Yeah, it'll basically be next week's episode.
Yeah.
Because this will go live this will go live on Friday basically. Cool. You can follow me at Trevor J. Starkey on Twitter. And yeah, I will just kind of second the shout out of like the YouTube channel in general. We have tons of Let's Plays up there. It's been a ton of fun doing those over the last 6-7 months now, I think. And in particular, we had a great time, me and Logan sitting down and playing through It Takes Two over 8 total episodes. So whenever you sit down and watch this, if there are 8 episodes out there, congrats, you've caught them all. You can also catch Cameron's playthroughs of Emily is Away 3 or my own playthroughs of Emily is Away 1 and 2, and maybe 3, depending on when I upload those videos, because I have them all, like, they're already uploaded, really. It's just a matter of, like, publishing them at this point. So keep an eye out for that if you like the Emily is Away series. But yeah, stay tuned for whatever else we have in store on the YouTube in the Let's Plays, and then also just our video versions of the podcasts are always a delight as well to sit down. You can see our lovely smiling faces as we do these things. But yeah, that is going to do it. You can follow all of us over at That Nerdy Site and check out thatnerdysite.com for all the latest from us. Once again, if you liked what you heard, please rate, review, like, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, ring the notification bell on YouTube, and if you aren't already supporting us on Patreon, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, where every patron gets early access up to a month prior to this very episode going live, kind of thing. We'll upload this, April 30th, and we'll put it out there to the rest of the world May 31st. So you get a whole month of exclusive access to episodes like this one. We basically do one of those every month of That Nerdy Site show. So it's a ton of fun. They basically break the format from our normal rigmarole of just talking about what we've been watching, playing, all that stuff, and we dive into fun topics like this one, diving into in particular Logan's encyclopedic love for Bond. So yeah, that is going to do it. Thank you again for listening. Thank you, Logan, for joining me. As always, stay nerdy and be good to each other.